Let's roll!
We are talking Mask of the Devil. This one is directed and co-written by Richard Roundtree and is a low-budget British horror comedy that on one hand you could say is Boogie Nights meets Evil Dead, but on the other hand you might say it's more like Coronation Street meets a nondescript kind of cheesy B-movie. What is the story? Well, it focuses on this character called Mary, who is an 18-year-old girl, and she's brought up in a kind of somewhat restrictive environment. Her parents are very religious. You know, her dad's a little bit kind of like old-fashioned, shall we say. And to try and kind of get some respect, she wants to get a job, and she ends up looking in the local paper and seeing an advert for a film production company, but it's actually an adult film production company, and the job is of a fluffer. If you're not sure what that means, go Google it. Anyway, and so she kind of ends up at this kind of set of this porno, and the theme of this porno is like a Tarzan kind of like porn spoof. And they've acquired a bunch of kind of like props and things. One of these props happens to be a legitimate kind of African tribal mask, which has actually got a curse on it and causes kind of like a demonic possession, which causes the whoever is wearing it to go on a killing spree. What'll happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss what I think works. Okay, so a low budget movie. It's all more or less in kind of one location. This kind of kind of film set studio. We get a little bit at the beginning of a few different kind of sets, but the bulk of the action takes place in this kind of one location with a kind of reasonably kind of small cast. So this is an interesting movie in regards to kind of tone, because it kind of has a very kind of comedic tone in the first half, but gets a little more kind of straight, so to speak, in the second half, when the kind of the horror kind of elements take more of a kind of a centre stage. So, you know, if you want to watch a straight horror film, the comedic elements here are very broad. So the first half will be a little bit of a different tone, shall we say. Now, is it enjoyable? It's kind of weird. You know, this movie has this weird kind of throwback feel to it. You know, we have these kind of like this intro that takes place, I think, you know, a couple of 100 years ago in Africa, where they kind of obtain the mask. We get all these kind of like sort of film grain sequences. We got this guy imagining himself as a kind of some type of martial artist, doing all kind of like video effects while he's practicing his martial arts, things like this. And the kind of the level of kind of dialogue and stuff. I mean, they're meant to be shooting this porn film, but the acting is kind of like you see in a porn movie, like a porn acting movie. So it's kind of like, it's a very kind of strange tone. And I think that's what the director was kind of going for here. But I think, you know, some people might see it as a little bit just cheap and nasty. But I gotta say, I think it was, for the most part at least I think, done by design. Kind of like this kind of weird sort of like surreal kind of movie that is. I mean, it's not an art house movie by any means. It's just one of these films that is a little bit bizarre. The story is relatively kind of basic and easy to follow. It's nothing kind of like confusing, but it just has these kind of like surreal kind of bizarre cutaway moments that are just, you know, a little bit kind of out there really. So it has this quite fun kind of quality to it. And I think the kind of like the hammy performances, which at least I hope were kind of done on purpose, to reflect the obviously what, you know, the kind of the stereotype kind of porno acting that you kind of get in films. You know, it's quite amusing at times. I will preface this by saying if it wasn't done on purpose, then the acting is kind of quite bad. But I don't know, to me it seemed like it was more by design than not, if that makes sense. The other thing I would say, more in the second half, where the movie becomes a lot more of a straight horror film, it's surprisingly gory and surprisingly violent, considering how light and fluffy the first half was, and the jokes more or less stop on the halfway mark. So, you know, it really has two very distinct halves, and the horror elements. You know, there are genuine moments of, you know, of a fear of danger, where we have this possessed character who is kind of stalking the survivors out of this kind of film studio, and there is a genuine kind of sense of threat. And when we do get our kills, you know, the camera does more or less show pretty much everything kind of going through, implements being put through people, you know, various kind of like gory deaths that I think, you know, certainly for the budget, I feel it's quite impressive, because there are some video, you know, SFX, CGI VFX that maybe isn't so good, but the practical stuff is, I've got to say, quite impressive, even though some of it, you know, like the mask itself, I don't think it looks particularly kind of good, but some of the gore effects, at least, I think do work kind of quite well. The other thing I would say is the characters are all quite distinct. You know, so we get introduced to the crew of this kind of this porn. You know, the stars, the director, the various technicians and stuff like that. And although they don't have a huge amount of kind of screen time, I do think the characters at least seem quite kind of distinct. So you're able to follow who's kind of surviving, who's kind of getting killed, and you know, you get a little flavour of kind of they are. And you know, even we get a little bit of behind the scenes, so to speak, of making a porno, and kind of how more humdrum it is, and how kind of not really sexy it is kind of in that kind of area, if that makes sense, which I thought was quite interesting. I think there's a few gags certainly in the first half, you know, about various kind of porn parodies and stuff like that, which I thought were quite fun. So let's talk about maybe what doesn't work, and I'm actually going to kind of call back on some of the stuff I say and look at the other side of the coin. I think the two distinct shifts in tone is going to be a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow for some people, because, like I've said, those expecting a straight horror film, there is a degree of that, but you've got to wait till the second half. And then if those who want a horror comedy, the horror element takes over, and comedy is more or less forgotten about in the second half. So it really has two distinct halves, which I feel it may have been better to kind of spread it a little more evenly, to be honest. So that the tone of the movie is a little bit more kind of consistent, rather than having two very, very kind of distinctive halves. And again, I want to go back to the acting. I think this was the choice for the filmmakers here, to have some of the line delivery be a bit stilted, a bit silly, very much like kind of porn acting. But I don't know if people will necessarily see that. And it might not even be the case. It might be the case that some of the acting here isn't particularly just good, and it just happens to be that's the kind of the connection that I've made. But regardless, how it comes across is stilted, and I don't know if it was intentional. People will realise that necessarily, and it would just seem like crappy acting. And the reason why I mentioned Coronation Street, and if you're not from the UK, basically it's a long-running kind of soap opera, because the first half of the movie seems a little soapy. You know, we have this Mary, who is this put upon girl. She's, you know, she wants to kind of get out the shadow of her parents. She wants to get a job, but she doesn't really know what she's doing. So it kind of has this kind of like soapy kind of element to it. And again, that kind of style of acting, certainly, it feels like, you know, when you see a soap opera and people don't, you know, they're not particularly well-known actors necessarily on soap operas, so some of the acting is a little bit kind of like, with some of these, I think. And again, it just kind of reminds me of this weird kind of soap opera kind of finish to it. Now, the movie, I think, struggles with a little bit of the budget here. As I've mentioned, I think the gore effects are quite good. But there are some kind of a little bit of overuse of CGI, which I don't think it was necessary, to be honest with you. And it kind of looks a little bit, you know, too cheap at times. And even kind of some of the set design, I would have liked to have seen it had a little bit more variety in kind of location. We get a few different locations at the beginning, But the bulk of the film is in this kind of, once we get into that kind of porno set, that's all we really see. And I think it kind of just looks like a generic offices. So we've got our crew and our cast working in these generic offices. Kind of doesn't look very interesting on a kind of a visual standpoint. The jokes as well, you know, as with comedies, it's, you know, it's down to the personal preference about what you actually kind of find funny or not. And to me, some hit, some didn't, and I think some of them seemed a little bit broad. Some of the characters seemed a little bit too kind of like, you know, over exaggerated in their kind of goofiness to a certain degree, and you can never really buy into them as real people because they're too exaggerated to a certain degree. Now, again, we get to the second half, and because it's more of a straight horror, they act a little bit more kind of straight. But the first half, you know, is kind of a little bit more goofy because of this. So this is quite a bizarre film, but it has an element of fun to it that I kind of enjoyed, and I kind of like this this kind of horror porno kind of backdrop to it, and it's this strange two distinct halves is interesting. So there are elements here that I found quite enjoyable, but I think as a package overall, I don't think it will suit everyone, but I found it at least watchable, so I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.